Hi, I'm Vivienne Roberts. I'm an art historian and curator in London. And I first came across Madge back in 1999 when I was introduced to her work by Roger Cardinal, who coined the term outsider art in 1972. He was instrumental in doing a lot of the early work on Madge, and he really was a champion of hers. And so we owe him a lot because without his early work, we wouldn't know so much of what we do today. And as soon as I saw her work, I was completely captivated and have taken up that baton now from Roger and champion her work as well. So she's a very special artist. Just to give her a bit about the background, she was born in 1882 in East London and a place called Walthamstow. And she had a difficult life. I think that's the easiest way to explain it. Her mother wasn't seen as fit enough to look after her, so she was left in the care of foster parents. And then I think about the age of 9 years old, she went to Dr. Barnardo's, and so she was looked after there. It's like an orphanage. And part of the work that they did was to try and help these underprivileged children by finding a new life. And so when she was about 14, she was sent to Canada. She didn't really like it there at all. She couldn't get back quick enough, and she didn't really want to talk about it. So she arrived back home in about 1900, and she found work as a seamstress, making blouses, and then she worked as a nurse at Whipps Cross Hospital in East London. So at that point, she kind of rekindled with her birth family, and she actually ended up marrying Tom Gill, which was her first cousin. And they started life in London and had 3 boys. And in between those, there was a bit of heartache. She had several miscarriages. But the last boy, I think, was born in 1913. And so just before the war. And then the war came, and that brought its own heartache. So her husband was sent off to fight, and Madge was left alone. Money was quite tight. She felt a bit estranged from the family at times, although she did have some contact with them, particularly her aunt, who was called Kate Gill. So Madge at that time, she had other illnesses as well to contend with. But the tragedy really happened in 1918 with the flu pandemic. And that's when she lost her son, Reggie, her beloved little boy. And she never really got over this. So 1918, she started to kind of, lose a little bit more of her sort of mental faculties, if you like. She started to suffer from sort of nervous disorders. But in 1920, she went out into the garden with her other 2 sons, and she had a visionary experience. She looked up into the sky, and she saw Christ on a cross with angels around him. And that really affected her. From that moment on, she created works at an amazing speed. It was relentless. She was writing automatically. She was stitching, playing the piano, singing, and drawing. So this was the floodgates. So she'd had to contend with a lot of illness. She'd contended with bereavement. And these were sort of the gateways open into a sort of a psychic experience. And so she believed that she was being guided by somebody called my inner rest. And people have looked at that as my inner rest. So it's something that was of solace to her, something that gave her some healing. And this person was guiding her. It was a female form. And all her works, she said, belonged to my inner rest and not her. Now, if you think of guides, spirit guides, helping artists, then that would be called mediumistic art. And the people who were most of the biggest proponents of mediumistic art tended to be women, and they tended to be women who were involved with the spiritualist movement that had started in 1848, and also theosophical movements as well. And Madge was a member of both of those. So they both became important to her. And even though Her nervous disorder started to get worse, particularly after she had a stillborn daughter in 1921. And she was also, around that time, 1920, she had lost her eye to cancer. So there's, again, many of these things were happening to her life. It was very, very difficult. And so she ended up having a spell in hospital 1922, just for a few months. And luckily she was under the pioneering expertise of Dr. Helen Boyle. So she had fantastic treatment. And she came out of hospital 1922, and she was still drawing. She was still working mediumistically. So whatever had happened to her, that did not diminish in any form. And she carried on until the rest of her life. So around this time, the early 20s, she came to the notice of people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famous for the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. And he was busy putting on exhibitions of mediumistic spirit-inspired art and photography. So she would have been really aware of some of the developments at that time, particularly spirit photography. And she also then started to exhibit in more mainstream art galleries, namely the Whitechapel Gallery, which was in the East End. And she exhibited there for many years. So throughout the 30s, well into the 40s, she was exhibiting there. So many other people were starting to find out about her work. She, at this time, got very involved with scientific innovation. So she knew about the work of wireless telegraphy from Sir Oliver Lodge or from Marconi, Flammarion, who was an astronomer as well. She became very aware of his work, and her work at this time began to reflect these. So she would use the language of wireless, of etheric. She would use astrological symbols, glyphs. All of these things would appear in her work. She actually at one point was doing horoscopes for people for a small fee. So she was looking to the esoteric to make a living at this point. She didn't want to sell her work. She believed that that belonged to my interest. So as this carried on throughout the 40s and the 50s, and then sadly she died in 1961. And when she died, nearly all her work was found in her house. Under every nook and cranny, there were works. Some of them were extremely large, up to 36 meters, wonderful works on sort of cotton calico. And others were on small postcards by the thousands. She also did works on cardboard, on scraps of paper. Her beautiful textiles, which were vibrant kaleidoscopic colors, they were all there waiting for a new chapter in their lives. So after her death, her son gave many of her works to Newham Council, and they're still there today, but others found their way into the secondary market. And this is where the chapter of sort of outsider art comes in. In 1968, there was a show called The Guided Hand that took place at the Grosvenor Gallery in London. And de Buffet became aware of her artwork, eventually buying a considerable amount that's now in the collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne, including the dress that she made and many of her textiles, calicos, and the postcards. They have a selection of all of those. So this started leading into like the 1970s, and that's when Roger Cardinal found out about her work and ended up writing a whole chapter looking at de Buffet's material, and eventually he included a chapter on her in his seminal book, The Outsider Art. A few years later, he co-curated a show called The Outsiders that took place at the Hayward Gallery in 1979. And their centerpiece in one of the rooms was one of Madge's large, beautiful calicos on this purple background. Really stunning. So from that moment, many outsider art collectors started to buy her work. They had her work in many collections and museums. And in 1993, there was a very prominent exhibition called Parallel Visions. It took place in Los Angeles, first of all, but then moved to Tokyo. And this increased her awareness to a wider market even more so. Throughout the 80s, this continued, 90s, and then to recent times. And something strange is really happening now is Madge Gill has always been known as an outsider artist, but slowly just recently with the rise of spirit-inspired art by women and the kind of the want of the art market and the art world to look at some women that have been overlooked in the history of art, Madge Gill is starting to come to the fore with other people like Georgiana Houghton and Hilma af Klint. And I think this is a really special time. It's a really special time to look at her work. Her work is still going to resonate with audiences today because it gives us an idea of hope, something else that can happen. Her work is about other worlds. It's about that something else can exist. And in times of uncertainty, when she first started producing her work in war, in pandemic, we're now seeing that again with audiences, and we're looking at her work and finding solace in it. We're finding healing in it. And I think this is one of the great things about Madge's work, that so over the period, over the decades, we have been looking at her work as maybe just as outsider, as self-taught, and that's amazing as it is. But now we're also looking at her work in a different way. And that just shows what a great artist she is, how she is transcending movements, transcending time, and we are moving along with her on this journey. And so whatever happens next in the next chapter will be interesting to see.